Jewelry can say many things on your wedding day. As a wedding band, it can say, "This is a forever symbol of our forever love." As a gift to your wedding party, it can say, "Thanks for standing up there with us." Blue Nile can help you find the piece that says it all and says it beautifully, with expert guidance and a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Go to BlueNile.com and experience the convenience of shopping Blue Nile, the original online jeweler since 1999. That's BlueNile.com.
The Athletic.
The Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco.
Gary explains F1's latest flexi wing controversy, explains why porpoising won't go away, and answers your questions on engines, running repairs, and part sharing. Welcome to another edition of the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me as always is a man who has been there and done that over half a century in and around F1, Gary Anderson. Gary, how's life with you?
Life's good, yeah. Sun's shining. It's a very nice day, to be honest. So can't complain about that at all. Got plenty to do, unfortunately, or fortunately. So just keep on going. Just stay out of the sunshine.
I always think you may be retired from Formula One teamwork, but you're probably about 90% as busy as you were in your F1 days, even in your so-called retirement.
Well, I do. I try to keep myself pretty busy. Do quite a lot of stuff for various little projects here and there, but not really in Formula One, because Formula One's become now one of these things where the teams are just so big that they cover everything themselves. Some teams cover it well, some teams don't cover it quite so well. But it's always interesting because you sort of look at it and think, what would I do in that set of circumstances? Because that's all you've got. You've got your past experience to relate. So what would I do in that set of circumstances? And that's the interesting thing, I think, looking at it from the outside, having been on the inside.
Yeah, it's certainly, well, I was going to say unique perspective, but there's very few people who have that perspective, let's put it that way, which is why it's always interesting. But as always, for our first topic of conversation, the floor is open for you to talk about topic or topics of your choice. So what's on your mind from the world of F1 tech right now?
Well, I think technically, I think we should have a little chat about the porpoising coming back in Monza, and also I think teammates and the internal battle in a team would be interesting. So starting off with the porpoising, Monza is a very different circuit in its own way, because obviously most of the cars there ran a lot lower downforce. Some didn't, but not quite so low, but some really did push the extremes at Monza. Ferrari was one of them. Obviously, they set their car up very, very focused on Monza because it is their home race, and rightly so. And they brought home a good result with pole position in third and fourth in the race was a pretty reasonable result. McLaren also ran with a low downforce setting, as did AlphaTauri, and obviously Williams. But as I say, with that comes other problems, and porpoising is one of them. Because I've said many times in my book, the one of the Red Bull's big advantages on the straight line speed is when they run a decent amount of downforce. The upper wing influences the beam wing influences the floor. And the more you can influence the floor, the more consistent the floor will be. But also, when you open the DRS, you have a sort of threefold drag reduction. Now, the floor itself is very efficient in producing downforce, probably something in the region of 8 or 10 to 1, which is way better than the upper rear wing, which is around about 3.5 to 1. But at the end of the day, if you can make it all work together, then while you have the upper wing shut, because you're generating a reasonable amount of downforce from it, the underflow will be working substantially better. Whereas if you do run a very small upper wing, then suddenly you're not influencing the beam wing or the underfloor as much. So the underfloor airflow separation problems appear earlier, because there's not the influence there to actually drag the airflow through underneath the car. It just gives up earlier, basically. Just can't cope with that. So quite a lot of on the Ferrari, really, because obviously we saw quite a lot of Ferrari in Italy, as you'd expect, and especially down from Ascari to the old Parabolica, as it used to be called. You could see a lot of bouncing. And there was some occasions where I thought Carlos Sainz's head was going to fall off. I mean, it really was quite bad. And I think Lando Norris has been complaining a bit about his back. And, all that does go through your spine. But it has got to a point, now where the FIA introduced a maximum acceleration, probably a fairly difficult set of numbers to equate because it's acceleration over time, over part of a lap, or blah, blah, blah. Make it as complicated as possible so nobody understands it. So that should be controlled. But basically, if the drivers are complaining about getting, the spine getting beaten up, then those numbers are not correct. So they need to be revised. But again, it's the same old thing. The team should be in control of that situation themselves. However, the team will always go for the best performance. And as we know, that it's been very difficult for the teams to predict porpoising. So I imagine whenever they're going for the best performance around a place like Monza, that that's about drag efficiency, downforce levels, blah blah blah, and they don't have a clue about the porpoising until they hit the track. So they got the best setup in the car for the best lap time, but porpoising just becomes a byproduct of that setup. So it's coming back, and I wouldn't be surprised to see. Well, if the FIA, look like they did last year, look at it closely, I wouldn't be surprised to see them changing that set of numbers. Now, the thing is that when you get to higher downforce tracks, as we're going to from here on in the season, the influence from the upper wing will have more influence on the floor, so the porpoising should theoretically get a little bit better. But I'm not saying that it'll just disappear. I think it's just inevitable that anything that's producing downforce because of a surface close to the ground, it will always run the risk of airflow separation problems. So, I think the jury's out on this one as to who's going to step in and fix it, whether it's the teams or the FIA. But if the drivers start moaning about their spines, then obviously the FIA might have to look at it again. And so we move on to drivers. It's one of these sort of situations where if you have a clear number one and number two, you don't have a problem. And whether you like it or whether you don't, right at the moment, Red Bull are in that enviable position. They've got Max Verstappen, who has earned his clear number one status, and Sergio Perez, who is a competent driver, but seems to struggle now and again, definitely more often than Max. So that gets you the dividing line between the two guys being A, on the same piece of track at the same time, and B, the old telephone call coming through the headset to say, take it easy here, So they don't have that problem. However, you move on a little bit further too, and again, you can take Mercedes with Hamilton and Russell, you can take Ferrari with Leclerc and Sainz, you can take McLaren with Piastri and Norris. You can look at quite a few of the teams and take their two drivers as being of reasonably equal status as opposed to a clear number one and number two. Now, Mercedes obviously in theory should have a number one and a number two, but they're, as a team, they're in a bit of turmoil this year, so I'm not sure they know how to do that really. But as we saw at Monza, between Leclerc and Sainz and that, or between Sainz and Leclerc, I suppose you should call it, in those last couple of 3 laps, it was a bit dodgy. So when you get two drivers that are in equal competition going to end up side by side on the track at some point in time, it's always very difficult to police. And the reality of it is something needs to be laid down before you go to a meeting, a Grand Prix. You can't do it at that time at the Grand Prix. You need to lay something down about when you would make decisions relative to positions, because you can be battling for position mid-race just because you're using a different strategy. If that happens, then when those two strategies are laid out in the pre-race meetings, you need to make sure that the drivers both know that driver X might be coming through after 5 laps or something after you've changed your tyres because he's on a different strategy, and it will all unfold near the end of the race. And then it's very unlikely that anybody will change tyres in the last 10 laps of a race or the last certain percentage of a race. So you say whoever's in front at that point in time, that's the finishing order. And as I say, it's exactly the same with Norris and Piastri. That was about coming out of the pits and getting a little bit too excited about trying to stave off your teammate. And, they actually, bank wheels, which is never good because it's so easy to damage the suspension in these things. So I think, prior to the race, you need to make sure you have a defined set of regulations that you're going to inflict on the drivers during the race. And depending upon the strategy, then you might move it around a little bit. But when you got two teammates, obviously it's very good for scoring good points in the constructors if they're both quick. But it's also very good for losing as many points in the constructors when they're battling with each other and wipe each other out. We didn't see that in Monza, but it was pretty close.
Well, I'm sure it brought back memories of Argentina 97 and Fisichella and Ralf Schumacher. But there was one extra dimension to that McLaren one, because obviously the reason that was happening was Piastri was obviously quite keen to get back past because he'd run ahead in the first stints of Norris, and Norris obviously passed him because he got the one-lap undercut. But that was a decision made by the team because Alonso had pitted before both of them. He pitted on lap 21 and he was posing an undercut threat. So they felt it was logical to do Norris first, then Piastri to defend the McLaren position, because contrary to what some of the more animated fans on social media might think, teams, for the most part, don't really mind if it's one driver in front of the other. It's the two cars that matter. Do you think that a team should avoid that kind of situation, or does it surprise you that this happens every now and again, that when there is a situation-specific one when they have to go out of order, if you like, and the second car pits first and you risk the swap? Do you think that just gets overlooked? It's not there in the plan? It's like sometimes this will happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not there in the big plan because you're racing, how the race unfolds depends upon who you're racing with. And obviously in that case, racing with Alonso as such, you may have to react to his strategy. So, it's okay to change what you're doing, but you have to be, defined about it. You have to get on the radio and say, this is the way it is, this is the reason. So, the driver needs to believe in what he's hearing, that's it, and not let his own self-interest overcome, the team, because the team's bigger than any driver. At the end of the day, It's just making those decisions, but you have to make them black and white. I didn't hear anything from Ferrari on that case. They seem a bit woolly as far as saying anything. I think, genuinely, I do think they would like Leclerc to finish ahead of Sainz. Internally, they'd like that, but they're not going to throw away, Sainz finishing ahead of Leclerc just for the sake of it. But they're not going to jump in and stop it potentially happening. Which would be, it's a fine line between how you fit in the team. So, but what you got to do is make sure that there's somebody there that can always say, "This is what you're doing, do it." Difficult when you're going out the pits like Piastri was there with Norris, because at that point in time, I don't think Piastri or Norris would have known what was going on. It was too soon. It was only 20 seconds or something after he'd stopped, if it is even that. So that was. To me, that was definitely a driver trying to be more assertive than his teammate, and that's never a good situation. That's the time whenever the drivers have got to read it themselves, and go for survival. Sometimes it's better to just give up a position than end up in the hedge, just because you've touched wheels.
Yeah, and I certainly understand why Oscar Piastri was keen to get back ahead, and as Andrea Stella, the team principal, said, that Piastri probably just slightly misjudged the grip level available on fresh hard, so just one of those things. But it was interesting with Ferrari because obviously they were given the instruction to race but with no risks, and I did ask Fred Vasseur after the race, said, well, didn't look to me a great deal like that came under the heading of no risks, what they were doing. Where do you stand on it? And he quite wisely didn't want to answer that. He said, I don't want to get into polemics. They both finished. That's fine. But I do wonder if that approach is a little bit dangerous, because you can take an all's well that ends well approach, but then it happens again and again, and eventually it's not going to end well, is it? And it might, if, say, McLaren don't crack down on it now, which they have done, the next time it happened, it could be when there's more than an 8th place at stake, for example.
Yes, I mean, it's like anything, isn't it? It will just escalate a little bit, because it'll be the feeling between the two drivers that, well, I remember what you did to me last time, so I'm going to be Mr. Difficult here. Just pay one back, because, at the end of the day, a racing driver's a racing driver. His job is to get the best result possible for him. On as far as he's concerned, on the side of that, so is the team's there as well. But whenever it comes, as you move up to near the front end, the driver's own priority steps on a little bit harder. So for 7th and 8th or something, you might just sort of say, okay, that'll be all right. But if it's 2nd and 3rd, or as with Leclerc and Sainz, 3rd and 4th, the pressure to just make sure you beat your teammate is just that little bit better, a little bit higher. And we always say, the first thing you got to do to prove your worth is beat your teammate. So you're never going to make it stop. But what I said earlier on in this thing is that's another one of the enviable positions that Red Bull are in. They shouldn't get to that position because Sergio Perez should know where he stands. Max Verstappen definitely knows where he stands. And as far as the calls from the pit wall is concerned, it would always be towards Max getting the best out of it, unless Sergio's ahead of him and there's a car between them. That's the big thing you've got to try and do. If you've got a situation, you need to have a car between you and the guy that you're sort of fighting with. If it was Sainz, Verstappen, Leclerc, then let Leclerc do all the fighting he wants, against Verstappen. But if you don't have a car between you and it's just you two going for it, then you definitely need to have some responsibility for the performance of the team.
And it's just one of the great things in Formula One, isn't it? For all the data and the technology and the design work and all these things, it's always two drivers in the car for your team, and you can never entirely control them. So I'm sure that's another topic that's going to come up again and again for as long as Grand Prix racing happens. Let's move on to our main topic, because for this weekend's Singapore Grand Prix, the FIA is having its latest clampdown on flexible bodywork with the issue of a new technical directive. Before we get into the detail of that, Gary, why are flexi wings such a persistently controversial topic in F1?
Well, flexi wings, it's one of these sort of situations. Obviously, the regulations call for the fact that I think it's 3.2.2 that all components, influence the car's aerodynamic performance to be rigidly mounted, blah, 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 blah. You'll never have a varying load component rigid. It can't be rigid. There's part of the underfloor under the driver's legs, the bib as we call it, where that can flex. It's actually on a spring and a damper. And that's mainly because, if you go over a curb and it hits the ground hard, you can definitely not do the driver's spine any good. So that's acceptable. Everybody has a bib system that can move, and there's a direct load test on it that it has to withstand. So that's there for safety reasons. But the other three components, really, I suppose that you might call it, that are influential to the car's performance is the front wing, the rear wing, and the floor edges, the floor sides. Those three are the things that you need that can influence the car's actual out-and-out performance. And also the mounting system for them. So in other words, the front wings mount on the nose, the rear wings mount on the rear crash structure, and the sides of the floor are a long overhung piece of carbon. You are allowed to stay there. So all of that stuff has to be tested, and there is a set of load tests from the FIA to actually see if the loads that they apply, if the wing withstands all of that, the wings and the floor withstand all that. So it should be okay, but from what I see on TV, some cars don't comply really with 3.2.2, which is rigid, or even the degree of rigidness. So this is what the FIA are sort of clamping down a little bit. They're saying, yes, you might pass all the load tests, but we have this catch-all, which says everything's got to be rigid, and we're going to start to enforce that a little bit more.
Well, this is the fundamental problem, isn't it? There's the load tests, there's also the general rule that basically says things can't flex, and then there's also the laws of physics, which mean there has to be some flex or you'll have brittle parts. So that's why this is, I guess, such a persistent grey area, isn't it? Because you have to allow something, and then you allow the teams that little bit of degree of freedom, and then people like yourself, as soon as you're given a bit of a degree of freedom, will try and make the absolute most of it. So that's, I guess, why there's this endless push and pull, because you get these clampdowns and then teams find new ways to do things and different things to target, which is why you get technical directives on this kind of thing on a relatively regular basis.
Well, I think first of all, before we sort of look deeply at what they're going to try and eliminate, if we look at the basic sort of specification that you'd lay down for a Formula One car, And these are all just simple rounded up numbers, that you come up with. Basically, the centre of pressure, you want 40% of the downforce in the front, 60% on the rear, roughly. Again, as I said, they're all just rounded up figures in my head. And you theoretically want that consistently. At all points in time, if you keep that centre of pressure the same, it would be okay. However, these cars tend to understeer low, medium speed corners, and you want more front end in the low and medium speed corners. So you start off with this specification where you have the underfloor is producing, let's say, 60% of the overall downforce. The front and rear wing is producing the other 40%. And let's say we divide that equally. The front wing produces 20%, the rear wing produces 20%. So you've got this situation where as speed increases, the downforce increases at the square of the speed. So twice the speed, 4 times the downforce. Now, if everything was linear and just kept working, that would be all happily. If the centre of pressure started off with the balance you've got it at 40-60, it would stay at 40-60. But that's not really what you want. You want it to be maybe 42-43% in the low and medium speed corners and 38% front in the high speed corners. So if you had a car that the underfloor and the front and rear wings reacted to just the speed change, you would have a car that would be oversteering in the fast corners or more understeering in the slow corners. So you want to end up with a situation, because on top of that, you multiply up the fact that when the load increases, the car gets closer to the ground. When the car gets closer to the ground, it seals better, so the underfloor works better. So the underfloor is working more than the square of the speed. Don't quite exactly know what it is, but it's more than the square of the speed. So whatever the centre of pressure shift is on the floor of the car, it will be greater relative to the front and rear wings. So it's a complex situation. But if you could have a car that's got the centre of pressure of the underfloor at, let's say, 50-50, and the wings then, front wing at 40% of the centre of pressure was moved forward to 40%, and rearward 60%, you'd have a car that, as it got faster, the centre of pressure of the underfloor, which is the dominating component that makes the downforce, the centre of pressure of that would move rearwards a little bit. So the car's centre of pressure would move rearwards. But you won't get as much downforce out of the underfloor if you have that. It's better to have the throat of the underfloor further forward and as low as possible to begin with. So you end up with a situation that if you just pursue downforce, you end up with a situation that the underfloor's centre of pressure is moving forward, and the only thing you got left to do then, whenever the driver's complaining about the rear being loose or oversteering in the fast corners, is to back off front wing. You get a lot of understeer low speed corners then. So then you get trick, and you get yourself a front wing that basically withstands the loads up to, let's say, 150 kilometres an hour or something, and then backs off a bit. So you see the flaps backing off. That means at high speed you've got a more stable rear end. At low speed you've got more front end. And as I said, the centre of pressure moves rearward because the wings are flexing. And that's what the FIA technical directive is going to try and do. So if it was me who was actually setting the spec of the car, I would actually try to separate the underfloor from the wings. Because with these front wings now being as high as they are, they're not really critical to ground clearance. They're not really in much ground effect. They do, but not much. So they will still produce more downforce as they get nearer to the ground. But the height of the front end, the height of the front wing is actually very consistent, because the rear of the car moves like twice as much as the front of the car. So it's pivoting around the front wheels. So as the rear's going down, front of the car's going down, the rear of the car's going down, the rear's going down further, so the front wing actually stays fairly stable. And that's what you want to try and achieve as well. So the front wing, ground clearance-wise, stays fairly stable. So I would try to get the underfloor centre of pressure to be 50-50, and as you lowered the car, the centre of pressure, if anything, from the underfloor move rearward, because that will give you stability in the high-speed corners, because the car moves lower to the ground at high speed. And then your front and rear wing could be rigid components, and keep that balance. But as I say, if you have the centre of pressure of the underfloor too far forward, the only thing you have to get rid of that low speed understeer and keep the stability in the rear end of the car at high speed is to get some mechanism for the front wing to back off.
Well, what you said there is a wonderful example of the complexity of it and how it's not just a single thing that you're trying to achieve with it. But we should talk a little bit about this specific technical directive and what the FIA is clamping down on. So this technical directive number 18 is actually one that existed a couple of years ago, then fell out of circulation. It's been kind of reactivated, for want of a better word, with lots of stuff added because it tackled rear wing flexibility before when it was first introduced, but then got integrated into the rules, and then there were reasons to kind of reactivate it with lots of added bits. So what exactly do we know about what this specific technical directive is tackling?
I think what they're just doing is throwing out a piece of paper there to say there is a catch-all for this. In this rigid bodywork, everything should be rigid. So as opposed to just the fact that there is X amount of load tests that go around the car on aerodynamic components, and if you pass the load test, you're okay. But, there's 2 or 3 different ways. There's obviously using aerodynamic airflow separation problems. There's aerodynamic load change that makes flexing happen. And there is design mechanisms that allow it to happen or even initiate it to happen. Now, some of the things that we used to do, not saying that anybody would ever do these sort of things again, is you'd have a front wing flap that's carbon skin moulded. It's moulded with the back edge not connected up as such. And then it's put together with a flexible bonding, just like a silicon joint. Keeps it together quite happily, but they can slip on each other laterally and deflect. There's just where you put the anchor, the pivot points, the anchorage of it, as far as where you want the angle to rotate around. So there's design mechanisms that you can use to make things flex. And there's also then trying to argue that point that these design mechanisms are there to stop them breaking because they don't flex. So, it's a fine line. If everything had to be rigid, I think we'd see a lot more failures just because things can't bounce around. We see the front wings when the driver goes over the curb, bouncing around dramatically on some cars. That's all okay. That's acceptable to a certain extent. It's when you get something like rotation in the wing. On the front wing, as I say, the front wing will back off when it rotates, or the flap mechanism rotates. The rear wing, if you backed it off, you obviously get rid of a little bit of drag, but you get rid of a lot of downforce as well. So I wouldn't have said that many of these cars currently would have a problem with the rear wing, because the FIA, you'll see on the rear wings these little white spots, and that is what the cameras focus on when the FIA are looking at them to see if there is any problems with flexing. So they have a lot of data. The FIA have a lot more data than we see. So it's one of those sort of situations where I think they're just sort of firing this technical directive out there and saying, look, we don't like what we're seeing in some cases. So we need to think about it. And we see the onboard camera of the front wing flap assembly. We, the viewer, can see that they back off on most cars, but on some cars to a much greater degree. Now you're going to always get something because of the load change. It's huge. But it is the degree, isn't it? It is the level of backing off. Now, the inboard end of the wing, the 2 little bits that are sort of mounted on the nose as such, that first 10 centimetres is the rigid thing that you're looking at. And then there's 2 little plates that slide on each other there to allow the flaps to bounce around a bit, I suppose you might call it. Going down the straight, if that flaps moves relative to that inboard mounted component more than X, so you can measure it more than X, then it should be illegal because that's a dynamic test. It's the truth. It's happening. It's real, and that's exactly what you want to do if you've got a car that basically the centre of pressure is too far forward from the underfloor, because as the car builds up speed, the centre of pressure of the whole car will move forward dramatically, and the only tool you've got to try and fix that is the front wing angle. And if the car was oversteering all the time, you'd basically run less front wing. So you're getting less front wing at high speed because it's flexing. So so it's not, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this. It's just it's in front of us all. But it is difficult to police. I have to say, it's very, very difficult to police and make sure that people are allowing it to happen because it's better for the component failure, but not abusing the regulation. As I say, I think that's why the FIA are firing this TD18 out, just to, hey, chaps, come on, let's play the game here.
Yeah, exactly. And it is fairly wide ranging, because they list various things that are going to be looked at and are definitely not allowed, about decoupled components that can kind of move around relative to each other, as you referred to, rotating relative to each other, and any kind of elastometric Phillips and that kind of thing, all sorts of things that can change those characteristics, and trying to make sure that everything is uniform across. So if you've got, say, a front wing element, that it's consistent in its flexibility across its whole length. You can have a certain amount of flexing, and they'll allow whole assemblies to an extent to flex, but it's all those little clever things that you can integrate into it, all those things that you can do to get that effect that isn't perhaps covered by the existing regs. So it's sort of one of those periodical curbs, isn't it, where they just curb a load of stuff and say, right, you can't do this, you can't do this, and then probably in a couple of years the teams have worked out a load of other ways they can achieve the objective, and there'll have to be another one.
Well, that's the team's responsibility, is to try to find, if there is a grey area, to try to get that grey area. Now, again, when the FIA did instigate these load tests, that gave the teams something to work around. If long as you pass that load test, what I would look very closely at is if anybody, as I say, has a design mechanism there that allows that flexure, i.e., a preloaded spring assembly or a torsion spring that's preloaded. Lots and lots of mechanisms could be generated. We talk about carbon materials and that can flex at load. Yeah, I'm sure they all exist. I don't think that's really a practical solution, because whenever you see how many wings, let's say front wings, the teams make, to get that consistency would be quite difficult if it's a material layup that you're using to do it. If it was a machine component that you're multi-axis, then okay, but to do it in a variable layup, just any overlaps, whatever, would be really, really difficult to police. I'm sure it could be done, but it would move the price of those components dramatically. And what you've got to see, and I think one of the questions later on is about damage to carbon fibre components and repairing it. You can't afford to just fire new wings at it every time you get a little scratch in it, or hit by a stone, or a bit of debris. You sometimes have to patch things up these days, which is great, because that's real life. The thing is, it's one of those, how much benefit can you get? If you built a car that suits the characteristics that the weight of these cars and that the tyres need, which is a car that has a centre of pressure that shifts rearwards with speed without cheating anything, i.e. that the front wing can be as rigid as practical, and the rear wing, and the floor sides, if that can all be real, then you have achieved the goal. If you get to the first test and suddenly the driver's moaning like mad about the fact that the cars are around his ears in high-speed corners and you have to back off front wing and get rid of understeer, then you've got a problem, and you've got to come up with solutions to it. And that's one of the solutions that you would come up with, allowing the front wing to back off. It's not a fix. It's a balance. It will keep the balance of the car better, and that's one of the things that you're looking for. All of these teams could probably generate, I'd say at the top of my head, 10% more downforce, but the car wouldn't be balanced. You'd have an unbalanced car. Balance is more important than actual downforce numbers. So in the pursuit of finding or chasing the specification of the car and how you would apply it, the philosophy of the car, I suppose you might call it, you need to do that from square one. You need to start that the first day you start your research on the car. You need to know what you're trying to achieve. And it's a bit like, let's say, steering aerodynamics. It has such a big influence, because if a driver goes into a corner, turns the steering wheel, he has a little bit of understeer, he puts more steering lock on the car. If the fact that turning the steering wheel is losing you front downforce, the minute he puts a little bit more steering lock on, it's worse. So that's the last thing you want. You want that whenever you put the steering lock on, initially for the first 2 or 3 degrees, you don't want much centre pressure shift. But if if the next 3 or 4 degrees, if it gets applied, you do want more centre pressure shift. And that will reduce the understeer in low-speed corners because you get more steering lock on it by definition. And at high-speed corners, it will give you a stable rear end. So it's all a circle of events with the whole aerodynamic package trying to get it all to work together. But if you don't start with the basic principles correct, and that to me is the underfloor that has a centre pressure shift as the car gets closer to the ground, then you're going to be chasing your tail.
And obviously, people listening to this will be wondering if there could be some great controversy in Singapore with this. It's always possible, but as part of this process, teams have had to lodge all their design details of the front and rear wing and key floor bits with the FIA for them to have a look at in advance so they can see what's going on there. So a fair bit of that will be pre-approved. And in fact, this whole technical directive process, the technical directive was originally published as a draft, so you get feedback from teams and everything. The idea is to get a workable thing so everybody understands where the line is on flexibility of components and that kind of thing. But of course, no matter what the FIA technical department does, there's always the possibility of some kind of formal protest because they don't decide whether something's legal or not. They have an opinion on it and they can tell teams that, but if somebody protests, whichever team, it then goes to the stewards, and the stewards have to decide, which is an interesting scenario. I mean, people will always say, why isn't the FIA just zero tolerance on this? Just have an absolute black and white rule. But I guess it's just physics, isn't it? That makes it very, very difficult. You can't have a black and white rule for this, although you kind of need one as there is, so you can apply it in situations where you feel people are going too far. So it's a very delicate balancing act, this whole policing business when it comes to flexible bodywork.
It is a very difficult balancing act, but that's really why the FIA brought in the selection of load tests it does across the components, rear wing, front wing, side of the floor and stuff. That that's all okay, but you've got them defined, you've got the position defined. It's not just in general. So you got to identify a problem before you try and make a decision whether it's good or bad, whether it's legal or not illegal. So, as I say, if I can sit and watch the TV and I see the front wing rotate and move at speed, which you can do, you know the car's increasing speed as it's going down the straight and the front wing flap's moving relative to everything else you're looking at, then as I say, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to know it's moving somewhere. So you go and try and show that video to the team and say, could you just explain why this is happening and how what the mechanism is for it? Because that's real. If Red Bull can see Mercedes front wing or McLaren's front wing or vice versa, it's the same old deal. They can see it all. So if somebody has to protest because of it, then it's a bit near the mark. I think the regulations, you can't make it rigid. You can't make it rigid, and you can't police being rigid. So because what part of the bodywork you test, where does rigidity set in at? So I think it's very, very fine line. And I think all you can do is fire out the warning shot that we're going to look at this in more depth. And if I was looking at front wings in Singapore, going from slow speed to high speed, and I saw the movement that I've seen so far this year on some cars, I'd hold them up if I was the FIA and say, here's a video, chap, explain that one to me. So we'll wait and see. It's always going to be difficult, but I'm sure there will be some in-depth discussion. Everybody in the pit lane is hoping that, some people in the pit lane are hoping that Red Bull lose half a second a lap. Some people in the pit lane are hoping they lose 2 seconds a lap. But I would be surprised if it's not the other way around and that Red Bull actually gain a little bit because of it. Because, it's one of those sort of situations where when I say I'm watching on TV, I haven't seen Red Bull contravening the front wing flexing as much as some other teams. So I think watch this space is the best way to talk about it.
Yeah, well, it's bound to be a talking point this weekend, and we'll certainly be talking about it as the Singapore Grand Prix and the races after progress.
You're listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Aramco continuously push the limits of engineering excellence. As the global energy partner of F1, they drive a shared vision to real-world innovation that aims to lower emissions, enhance performance and accelerate human potential. Aramco, powered by HAL.
Well, if you're listening to this podcast, you understand the value of asking questions. At Aramco, answering questions helps them engineer a better future. So if you'd like to know how something works in F1, please send us a question that we can answer on a future episode of this podcast. It can be on absolutely anything, F1 ancient or modern, or just some technical question you've always wanted to know the answer to. And my usual reminder is that there's no question too simple or too complicated for Gary to take on. You can send us a written email on podcasts@therace.com, or if you prefer, record a voice note and send it to us, making sure you tell us who you are, and then we can play that in the show so everyone can hear your question. Our first question today is from Niklas from Malmo in Sweden, who says, I have a question regarding the engines each team has in their pool. Are they identical, or do you have different tweaks for different track types? Could there be any potential in having slightly different strengths in the power units?
Well, yes, it's a somewhat grey area, I suppose you might call it. These engines have all been homologated at the start of the year. And the big thing is that the only thing you can really change on the engine as the season progresses is for reliability reasons. And it's a big argument about what is for reliability and what is for performance. So let's say if you started the season and you could, the engines can rev to 15,000 RPM, I believe, at this point in time. So let's say, you start the season off and you're just running 13,000, 13,500, something like that. And it's because you think you've got a valve system problem. As the season progresses and you fix that reliability problem, and then you can go up to 14,000, then 14.5, and then maybe 15,000. So you're making the engine better as the season progresses. And as I say, it's the argument between the team or the engine builder and what the FIA accept as reliability. You have to define the reliability, and that gets issued to all the other engine manufacturers as well. You have to define what you're trying to do to get reliability. So I have no doubt that as the season progresses, you will improve the performance a little bit from engine to engine. And I think, once again, if you plan it correctly, and as we know, the two Ferraris put new engines in for Monza, I'm sure they were the best of the bunch. They were the best of the pile that they had. So it's one of those sort of situations where, yes, there will be improvements as the season goes along, defined as reliability improvements, but I wouldn't be surprised if those reliability improvements actually give you a little bit more power improvement. And for Monza, it might just be a few revs, that's all. But an extra 200 revs or something could be of an advantage.
Our next question comes from Isaac Carissa, who says, I'm curious to know how repairable and serviceable the wing elements are on modern F1 cars. I often see eye-watering price tags attached to these parts, but I can't believe teams would bin a $200,000 front wing for a broken end plate.
No, very few teams would bin a $200,000 front wing for that. There is repairs. Obviously, it's one of those sort of fine lines, because if it's just an end plate damage on the outboard end of the wing, then the wing will go back in the mould and be all cleaned up, that end, and a new part put onto it, a new end part plate put onto it, and blend it in as such. However, the problem with that is, for the big teams, it all adds weight. Well, for every team, it all adds weight. So it's a fine line between how damaged it is and how much money you got left in the budget. So there's a fine line between introducing a development of the front wing at the same time as you've lost a couple of the old ones. They're all decisions that you'd make at time. I think front wing is maybe a little bit less than that. A nose assembly, front wing, and all the flap arrangements, at a maximum 200k, but I would say it's more like 120k, something like that, £100,000, because the wings are a lot simpler than they were a few years ago. But even still, that's a lot of money. It's a pretty good road car. I wouldn't mind one of them. But so every team will have a degree of acceptance for repairs. Most of the teams run with some ballast in the front wing to help the weight distribution, but not very much. It's you're talking maybe a couple of kilos. So most of the teams want the car to be down in the weight limit, but sometimes you have to run a couple of kilos over the weight limit just to get the weight distribution and to help the tyre degradation. So as long as you stay within that window of your front wing repairs, and you can take some of that ballast out of the front wing and just have it there because you fixed the front wing, have the right weight distribution, then it'd be okay, it'd be acceptable. But once you get outside of that acceptance level, then I think that's when it will go in the bin.
Just how far gone can a wing, say a front wing, be in terms of being repairable without adding too much weight to it? I guess if it's a proper full-on crunch with multiple bits broken, that's the point where you sling it in the skip. But how far can you go? I
think as a sort of quick reference, if it is a front wing end plate and it's the outside 10 centimetres of the wing where it all falls down to a fairly flat section, then you'd have a pretty good go at looking at fixing it, because the end plate itself would be moulded as a separate component, so it'd be about repairing that bit of the wing and putting that whole separate component onto it. But if it's broken inboard of that bit, if it's broken 10 centimetres from the nose, then it's a bin job. The structure you can't really get back to what you had, but the structure is, that first, 50 centimetres, 60 centimetres, that's the structural part. And once you get into that area, you'd definitely put it in the bin. Outside of that area, you'd think about it. But definitely if it's on the last 10 centimetres out to the end plate, you'd definitely have a go at fixing it.
And given how much front wing damage there is over the course of an F1 season, it's mind-boggling how much is spent on that.
It's just crazy why we got all this stuff about outwashing. Just to move that front wing end plate, the overall width of the front wing, in by 10 centimetres, you'd eliminate 99.9% of the accident damage, as we see, because the minute they're level with the outside of the front wheel, and whenever you turn the front wheel in a slow-speed corner, the wing is the widest part at that front, but until you get to the centre line of the wheel. Why doesn't somebody have some brain and just bring it in by 10 centimetres and say, okay, this is the way it is, there'll be less potential for outwash, there'll be less damage, there'll be less bits of carbon fibre on the track. It's a positive for everybody. So I don't understand. I don't understand some of the logic between the regulations and car design.
Yeah, you can't approach the regulations in F1 with common sense and logic. That's not the way to go with it.
Yeah, but Ed, I'm just a basic Irishman, Common sense has to come in somewhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we'll set you on rewriting the regulations one day. I'm sure that'll keep you a bit too busy, I think, in your retirement. So best not to do that. And our final question is from Jacob Woolen, who says, "I'm wondering how much in terms of Red Bull parts and design AlphaTauri would be legally able to use in next year's car."
Well, it's all in the regulations as to how much you can do. Haas, to an extent, do the same thing, but I believe that AlphaTauri's connection to Red Bull, it could be a little bit more. Theoretically it can be the same, but let's say that you're looking at running this year's Red Bull as an AlphaTauri next year. There's millions of pictures of a Red Bull out there. So for you to sit down now and design a copy Red Bull, I suppose you might call it, you would be able to do a lot of it, especially with the inside knowledge that you have of from Red Bull as well, to try to direct you a little bit on the objectives of the design. So I think you could have a Red Bull copy as an AlphaTauri car very easily. There might be subtle changes here and there, subtle differences that would just mean that it's a new car that you've actually designed and you've actually built. It's not taking a Red Bull chassis, for example, or a Red Bull side pod or a Red Bull underfloor and apply it to your car. Obviously, they can take the Red Bull engine, which is what they're doing, gearbox, rear suspension, rear uprights, front suspension, front uprights, steering rack. It's endless the amount of parts you can take, but it's the things that hold all that together. And the most important thing about a car and its performance is the aerodynamic philosophy of the car. What you've set down to chase, that's what I was saying earlier about the centre of pressure shift, is what you've set down as your initial requirement from the car that's important. And if AlphaTauri could latch onto that down the pub one night over a couple of pints of Guinness with some of the Red Bull aerodynamists, well, then that's all you need, because you can achieve it in many, many different ways. It's just a matter of knowing what you want to achieve.
It's an interesting scenario, and I suspect it could become quite controversial because obviously the talk of much of AlphaTauri moving to Milton Keynes, so it'll be in a building by Red Bull. Plus, they're going to use more of the parts because there is still plenty for them to go in terms of increasing that, because they tend to get year-old parts for a start. The Haas deal with Ferrari gives them latest spec parts as well. And if you want to very, very broadly say it's split between, you can take the mechanical parts, but aero parts you can't. There are a few other parts like the monocoque you have to do yourself. But it's going to be very interesting, isn't it, when we have the situation when an AlphaTauri hits the track that's maybe got as many Red Bull parts as they can throw at it, a similar aero concept. Now, that team's never gone full-on Red Bull clones, well, not since customer cars were outlawed. So that could be really controversial, couldn't it, if we get something that's visibly a Red Bull clone, because how do you know about the aero information sharing in the way you say there? I mean, I'm not suggesting they do it, but you can't swap design data. And where does that stop? Where's the grey area in the middle? So I can see that if AlphaTauri were to take a leap forward, could become problematic, because at its best, that team could be a real problem among some of Red Bull's rivals.
No, I think that last part there, Ed, that you just say is the big criteria. You know, if AlphaTauri languish around 15th, 16th, 14th, or whatever, qualifying next year with a Red Bull, okay, nobody will get too excited about it. But if there's 2 Red Bulls and 2 AlphaTauris in the front 2 rows of the grid, then somebody will get excited about it. And that's going to be the interesting thing, I suppose, coming into next year. I think, you know, and this is maybe wrong to say, I think we'll see quite a lot of Red Bulls next year, because I don't see any reason for not to see quite a lot of Red Bulls or derivatives of Red Bulls. But it's one of those sort of things where every team wants to stand on its own 2 feet somehow, and it depends on who's driving the team, whether it's the technical side or whether it's the pressure of the management, I suppose you might call it. And that's an interesting fact. You know, we've had the conversation many, many times about why change stuff. And sometimes the people that don't actually know jump in and say, well, why doesn't our side pods look like a Red Bull? Or why doesn't our airbox intake look like a Ferrari or whatever? You know, and sometimes it's easier to change things just because of the pressure coming from the people that don't know than it is to allow it to happen from the people that theoretically do know. So that's an interesting thing. And I think it'll be the next year's case of AlphaTauri and Red Bull will be an interesting example of what you can do, because the one thing that Red Bull have been good so far at is exploiting grey areas to the maximum, which is what you have to do if you're going to build a quick car. But this is exploiting grey areas to a maximum in a different style as to how much you hand over to your sister, brother, twin team. I don't know what you like to call it. But it's going to be definitely interesting next year. I would go for everything I could if I was at AlphaTauri now. Maybe not if I was at AlphaTauri as a technical director, because I'd love to stand on my own 2 feet. But if I was at AlphaTauri as a sort of maybe a technical team principal-ish, I would be dotting the I's and crossing the T's in every component that I could even have a sniff at.
Yeah, and that certainly seems to be the direction that AlphaTauri is being pushed now. So I think we definitely will see more of that next year. Well, thanks very much to everyone who sent in questions, and thanks to you, Gary, for your excellent answers, as always. And remember, if anyone has an F1 Tech question, you can get it to us on podcasts at the-race.com. That's podcasts at the-race.com. We really do appreciate the questions you send, and we read every single email, even if we don't always have the time to answer them on the podcast. That's all we've got time for in this episode, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another edition, so stay with us for more from Gary. You've been listening to the Race F1 Tech Show, brought to you by Aramco. Be sure to like, follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode.
The Athletic.